I'm not really sure what all this EVA stuff is about, but apparently it's got something to do with anime. Indeed, here you have got EVA branded gear from Asus and non-EVA branded gear, which is pretty much identical other than the overall aesthetics. Case in point is the ROG Strix XG27AQM. Now this EVA branded monitor can be found for £900, however if you go for the non-EVA branded variant of it, it can be found for roughly £670 to £700 or $670, so indeed making it a lot more appealing and affordable. Now, no matter which model you go for, you'll find a 27-inch 1440p 270Hz IPS panel with ELMB Sync and HDR400 certification. In this review, you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and how it competes to rival offerings. Now before jumping into the review, I would like to point out that this monitor has got two DisplayPort 1.4 inputs, which is great for driving 1440p at 270Hz, however has got two HDMI 2.0 ports. These are going to limit you to 144Hz at 1440p or 1080p at 270Hz. As such, you will have to make sure that you have got a DisplayPort output, in other words, from your graphics card or your laptop or whatever it might be, in order for you to fully attain the max refresh rate and resolution. Now with that in mind, let's talk about its gaming performance, and what better way to kick off than input lag. Now here I had it tested objectively at 2.7 milliseconds, which isn't the lowest that I've tested to date, but is still very impressive. As a result, I don't think you'll have any problems whatsoever, no matter what sort of input that you have, be it mouse or of course a controller. Now subjectively, I will say, playing a game such as CSGO, which is very intensive, I felt that my mouse clicks were responding really quickly, and as such I didn't feel that the monitor's input lag was any hindrance whatsoever. Now of course, input lag is only one side of the puzzle, so what about when it comes to its response time and the amount of overshoot ghosting? Well, here the monitor has got a few different overdrive modes to select from, level 0 up to level 5, and then of course you've got ELMB Sync. Now you'll be able to see via the UFO ghosting test that when it comes to the overdrive modes, level 5 does incur a little bit of inverse ghosting, while ELMB Sync does incur any sort of ghosting, and yet the UFO is a lot more clearer. So what about when it comes to the numbers? Well, here via the OSRTT tool, I had it tested on every single level. Now level 0 gives you 5.88 milliseconds, which you will be able to see on the average initial time on the bottom left hand side of your screen. But also do bear in mind the RGB overshoot. As we progress to level 1, you can see here the response time decreases to 5.18 milliseconds. Then we go to level 2, it gets down to 4.75 milliseconds, and then as we go to level 3, it goes to 4.04 milliseconds, and then for level 4 it gets to 3.27 milliseconds. Now I'm going to quickly stop us right here, because if we look at the RGB overshoot, you can see some occurrences happening whereby you've got 18 and 21 being measured over here. So now we're going to move over to level 5, and yes, suddenly you can see a lot more red on your screen. The RGB overshoot becomes a lot more noticeable, and while we do have a faster average initial time of 2.74 milliseconds, which is insanely low, I actually preferred using this monitor on the level 4 mode, as it didn't incur as much inverse ghosting and didn't throw off my shots as much. Now you might have noticed that I didn't have a figure for ELMB, and indeed that's because the current limitations of my testing methodology. I don't have an oscilloscope, for example, and therefore can't get an accurate figure via the OSRTT tool. As such, I can only give you my subjective opinion, and indeed over here via ELMB, it was certainly impressive, very much likened to, let's say, the level 4 mode, because it didn't incur any sort of inverse ghosting and yet gave me a very responsive panel. I was very much taken back by how good ELMB mode was, and was something that I could see myself using. Now it is the only caveat is that it very much does limit the overall peak brightness. I will touch upon this further down in this review in the image quality section, whereby I break down the different brightness levels that this monitor is able to produce. Now I would like to point out that ELMB Sync is able to run simultaneously with AMD FreeSync or indeed NVIDIA G-Sync. It also will run at 270Hz, 240Hz and 120Hz. However, it will not run at 60Hz, nor will it run simultaneously with an HDR signal, something worth considering if you're using this monitor in said scenarios. Now this does perfectly lead me onto its VRR technology, and here the monitor has a range of 48 up to 270Hz. Indeed, it does not have a built-in G-Sync module and therefore cannot benefit from the full VRR range, in other words 1 to a 270Hz, whereby its competitor, the Alienware AW2721D, does have a native G-Sync module and therefore will give you a better tear-free gaming experience, at least of course if you're on an Nvidia graphics card. Now in my case, I have got an RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort, I had no problems running the Nvidia Pendulum demo, nor did I have any problems playing Destiny 2. Now here the monitor was able to run 270Hz at 1440p with HDR and G-Sync all simultaneously running without any problems. I didn't incur any sort of screen flickering or any sort of black screen issues, but of course your mileage may vary depending on your own setup. Now with said setup, the monitor was running HDR and indeed did not have any ELMB. Now this does give me the opportunity to put it through its paces when it comes to its HDR performance, and here I must say I was left pretty disappointed. See, it only has HDR400, and by comparison the Alienware AW2721D or the Samsung Odyssey G7 provide a far superior experience thanks to the HDR 600 certification that they have. There's of course some other alternatives out there on the market which similarly give you an HDR 600 experience. Suffice to say, if HDR is important, you should definitely look elsewhere. Now in my case, I actually preferred playing this monitor on Destiny 2 with SDR, and that's because the dynamic dimming option became enabled. Oddly, it's grayed out when you have an HDR signal, which I'm not sure if it's constantly running or constantly disabled, but regardless, the dynamic dimming option was certainly appreciated in SDR because it allowed colors to pop a little bit more and therefore gave me an even better experience on Destiny 2. So with all of that in mind, what about when it comes to console gaming? Now this monitor shouldn't be solely bought for console purposes, but rather if you have a console running alongside a computer, then it might make sense for you to plug it in. Now I did test the monitor at 120Hz, and here you can see how it does in terms of the UFO ghosting test, and then transitioning onto the OSRTD test, I went through all the variety of different overdrives, whereby level 3 ended up being the best when it came to 120Hz. Now moving on to 60Hz, again the UFO ghosting test actually reveals that level 4 was a lot more playable. Again, flicking through the different OSRTD test, this is the mode that I found to be the best in terms of the RGB overshoot and also the overall average initial time. Ultimately here on a console at 120Hz, you should get away with level 3 overdrive. At 60Hz, you'll get away with level 4 overdrive as you would do, let's say, on a PC at 270Hz. Now in this respect, in terms of the refresh rate and resolution, you will be able to run 120Hz 1080p on PlayStation or on Xbox, and then moving on to 1440p, you should be able to run 60Hz on a modern day PlayStation. If however you want 120Hz and you want VRR, then you will probably want an Xbox whereby this will natively support it. So with gaming out of the way, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, here the monitor runs a 27-inch 1440p panel that runs an IPS panel technology. Now in my case, I had no problems when it comes to text clarity or indeed in terms of viewing any sort of material. Now when it comes to the overall color accuracy, the monitor has got a dedicated sRGB emulation mode which you can enable through the OSD. In said mode, you will be able to note that the average delta E sits at a whoppingly low 0.83, while the maximum sits at 3.23, which is certainly impressive. Here, however, the gamut coverage sits at 85.1% and the gamut volume at 86% in comparison to the sRGB standard. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB gamut. Now when it comes to its tested contrast ratio, it was 983:1, whilst the measured white point at a 6504 Kelvin target was 5588 Kelvin, which isn't too bad. As for the gamma curve, it's pretty much on point to the 2.2 standard. Now while I appreciate sRGB mode will give you a little bit of subdued color experience, at least to the naked eye, I will say that it seemed a little bit more apparent on this Asus monitor. As such, I actually preferred using it outside of sRGB mode and using it on the user preset that you can select through the OSD. Now this seemed to be more tuned to the Adobe RGB standard. Here you'll be able to see that in terms of the gamut coverage and gamut volume, they of course exceed sRGB and go towards more of the Adobe RGB or DCI-P3 modes. Below you can see how it compares to the Adobe RGB standard. Now when it comes to the average ΔTE in comparison to the Adobe RGB levels, it's got an average ΔTE of 1.73 and a maximum of 4.27. Tested contrast ratio doesn't change, but the measured white point does slightly alter and actually gets a little bit better at a measured 6260 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it's still very impressive and quite near to the 2.2 standard. Now moving on from raw image quality, what about when it comes to its brightness? Well, here I had it tested in HDR at a whopping 570 nits, getting quite close to the 600 standard with HDR, but unfortunately not quite hitting it. As a result, you can see why it's HDR400 certified. Do bear in mind my comments that I made before about its HDR performance anyway. Now when it comes to SDR brightness, it does get up all the way up to 453 nits, which is certainly impressive. It is worth bearing in mind that if you do enable dynamic dimming, it will limit the peak brightness, at least from my own testing methodology, at 412 nits. Now as for the sRGB mode, it will limit brightness very much like ELMB, and here the brightness level sits identically at 175 nits, which isn't actually too bad, although might be a little bit dim for certain individuals. As for its minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 65 nits, which is certainly impressive. Now moving on, we get on to brightness uniformity, which isn't bad across the board. As for backlight bleed, of course it's an IPS panel, so it does suffer from a little bit of it in comparison to, let's say, a VA panel, but in my case I found it perfectly acceptable, even in a completely pitch black room. Of course, if you do not want this whatsoever, or you want to minimize on backlight bleed, you will have to look at a VA panel in comparison to any of the IPS panels that are in existence. Now moving on, we get onto the monitor's OSD that can be accessed through a physical joystick button found behind the monitor, making it quite convenient. First off, you do have got overclocking, which you might want to enable, for example going from 240Hz up to 270Hz, whereby I've got no sort of inherent disadvantages of doing that. Then you have got the overdrive modes, as I did reference before, and then adaptive sync, ELMB sync as well, and as for Game Plus, this is for example if you want to enable a crosshair. Game visual, this is relating to the image quality section of this review, whereby I had user mode and sRGB mode, which you might want to select, and then shadow boost, I leave that disabled. As for image, contrast and brightness are somewhat subjective, and as for dynamic dimming, as I did mention before, it can be enabled in SDR, although it does seem to be dimmed out or grayed out in HDR. You have also got ASCR, which boosts the contrast ratio, although I preferred leaving this disabled. As for aspect control and blue light filter, they're somewhat self-explanatory. As for color, you have got the color temperature, whereby I would suggest user mode over the other ones, and then gamma controls, leaving it at 2.2, and saturation, leaving it default at 50. You have of course got input select and then the lighting effects. Now the lighting effects are RGB lights which reside behind the monitor. They're not exactly bright enough to give you that sort of ambi-glow effect, but nonetheless are there for you to use. In my case, I actually fully disabled them, but if you do want to enable it, you can do so via here, or enable Aura Sync if you have got other Asus branded peripherals. You then have got the favorites which you can set, so for example shortcuts or in certain settings, and via the system setup you have got sound, where this is within the built-in sound, so in other words via the 3.5mm jack. You can enable or disable the standby of the USB hub, lock the power key if in case you're going to be accidentally pressing it. You can also disable the power indicator, which is found at the front of the monitor, and then as for DisplayPort version, you'll certainly want to enable this at 1.4, and other than that you also have some information as to the refresh rate and the resolution and the certain settings that are enabled or disabled on the monitor. Now moving on from the OSD, I should mention the build quality and design, and of course as I have mentioned, I have got the EVA Edition variant of it. As a result, the stand is different coloured. But of course, if you do not go for the EVA Edition variant of it, you'll have the same sort of stand, just not the same sort of colour coding. Now here, the stand itself provides height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustment, all of which feels very sturdy, and it doesn't give any sort of wobble to the monitor. If you do not want the stand, you can replace it via a VESA compatible stand if you so wish. Now the monitor itself has got a 3-side borderless design and a relatively thin bezel at the bottom, meaning it doesn't sort of detract from the overall look when it's sat on a desk, at least not in my opinion. Now, one thing I should point out that this monitor does not have any built-in speakers, which is really no sort of surprise or any care for me, but I know some people look out for speakers, such as, for example, if you're going to be gaming on console. As such, over here, you will have to output via the 3.5mm jack, which is found underneath the monitor, beside the display ports. So with all of that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and frankly, I see the Asus ROG Strix XG27AQM being geared towards hardcore competitive gamers that want 1440p at 270Hz on a 27-inch IPS panel form factor. Now, as a result, I can still see myself recommending it, and as such it gets my performance award. However, I can't wholeheartedly recommend it because there's some alternatives out there on the market. My top pick would still be the Alienware AW2721D. While it doesn't offer ELMB Sync, it does otherwise give you a superior experience. Thanks to its native G-Sync module and HDR400, it will give you a far superior experience over the Asus monitor. Elsewhere, if you do not mind a curved monitor and want a VA panel instead, you should consider the Samsung Odyssey G7. Then you've got two offerings from AOC with the AG274QG and the AG274QS, both of which are spectacular gaming panels that hit 240Hz and 300Hz at 1440p respectively, and are still very good panels, although do come in at an extremely high premium. So suffice to say, there's some alternatives out there, and I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts of this monitor down in the comment section below. If you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.